was a sound every infantryman prayed to hear. The distinctive thump of a mortar firing, the whistling arc of its shell, and the thunderous crash as it found its mark among the enemy. But in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, December 1944, for one isolated American company, that sound had gone silent. Their mortars were destroyed, their ammunition depleted. Before them lay a relentless enemy advance. Behind them, a crucial road junction they had been ordered to hold at all costs. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of options. Or so it seemed, because in a desperate hour, a handful of engineers, a resourceful officer, and a stack of ordinary water pipes would forge a weapon born of sheer necessity. This is the story of ingenuity under fire. This is the story of when soldiers had no mortars left, and the water pipe weapon that fired 100 shells. Our story unfolds with a 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, attached to the U.S. First Army. By mid-December 19, the surprise German offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, had thrown the Allied lines into chaos. Isolated units fought desperate holding actions to slow the German spearheads. One such unit was a composite force from the 291st, reinforced by a ragged collection of retreating infantry and artillerymen, tasked with defending the vital crossroads near the small Belgian town of Moumidi. Commanding this ad hoc group was a young, determined captain, Richard P. Gleason. Captain Gleason's men were not frontline assault troops by trade. They were engineers. Their expertise lay in building bridges, laying mines, and clearing roads. But now, they were all that stood between German panzers and a deeper breakthrough. The strategic situation was dire. The crossroads controlled access to a network of roads essential for both the German advance and the American reinforcement. If it fell, the German 1st SS Panzer Division could pour through virtually unhindered. The weather was a character in itself, a bitter, pervasive cold that seeped into bones, with a thick fog that clung to the pine forests and reduced visibility to mere yards. The men dug fighting positions in the frozen earth, their breath forming icy clouds. Their heavy weapons consisted of a few .30 and .50 caliber machine guns, rifles, and crucially, 281mm M1 mortar. These mortars were their equalizer, their ability to reach out and strike enemy formations, assembling beyond the tree line without exposing their own positions. For 2 days, they had repelled probing attacks, the mortar firing expertly called missions by their crews. But the pressure was building. German patrols were getting bolder, and the rumble of armor grew steadily closer. The men knew a major assault was imminent. Their orders were simple, final. Hold. Hold until relieved. Their mortars were the key to that defense. But by the morning of December 21st, after a fierce pre-dawn assault, that key had been shattered. The German attack came just before first light. A company of Volksgrenadiers, supported by 2 armored reconnaissance vehicles, struck the American perimeter with sudden, Bulin force. The fighting was close quarters and brutal in the fog. American machine gun nests cut down gray-clad figures emerging from the mist, while the mortar team, led by Sergeant Frank Kreese, worked feverishly. Thump, thump, thump. Shell after shell arced into the attacking force, breaking up their formations. The attack faltered. 10 fell back, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. One of the armored cars, a German SD, Cafeceta 234, had pinpointed the mortar position. A high explosive round from its 20mm cannon scored a direct hit. When the smoke cleared, the scene was one of devastation. The mortar tube was twisted, useless metal. Its baseplate was cracked. Worse, the majority of their precious 81mm mortar rounds had been detonated in the blast. Sergeant Kreese and one of his crew were wounded. The other mortars, its crew exhausted and low on ammunition, was down to its last dozen rounds. Captain Gleason surveyed the damage, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Without indirect fire capability, his thinly stretched line was terribly vulnerable. The enemy would regroup, they would bring up heavier support, and they would overwhelm his fixed positions. His fears were confirmed by scouts. By 1400 hours, reports filtered in of increased German activity in the woods to the east. Through brief gaps in the fog, they could see figures moving, not just infantry, but the dreaded outlines of at least 2 Panzer IV tanks, their long 75mm guns sniffing for targets. A larger, coordinated assault was forming. The Americans had perhaps an hour, maybe 2. The remaining functional mortar fired its last shell at a suspected assembly area. The final thump echoed. Then there was a deafening silence. The company's teeth had been pulled. Gleason gathered his sergeants and his few remaining officers in the cellar of a shell-blasted farmhouse that served as his command post. The air was thick with tension and the smell of damp wool and cold sweat. Options were discussed and discarded. A fighting retreat would abandon their crucial objective and likely turn into a rout under tank fire. Calling for artillery support was impossible. Their radios could not reach the rear echelons through the jagged terrain. They were on their own. It was then that Sergeant Linus MacMcGregor, a burly engineer from Pittsburgh who had worked in a steel mill before the war, spoke up. His voice was calm, almost mad. "Captain," he said, "we can't fire mortar, but we might be able to make something that throws shells." He gestured out the door, toward the shattered remains of the village's water pumping station they had passed days earlier. "There's a pile of steel pipes back there, thick-walled, about 4 inches across. We cut 'em, mount 'em on a plate, use a primer charge. It's just basic physics." The men stared at him. The idea was audacious, born of a mechanic's practicality. It was also incredibly dangerous. Homemade, untested ordnance was as likely to kill its crew as the enemy. But Captain Gleason, facing annihilation, saw not insanity, but a glimmer of hope. "What do you need, Sergeant?" he asked. The clock was ticking. Meanwhile, in the relative shelter of a stone barn behind the lines, Sergeant McGregor and his team were engaged in a different kind of battalion race against time and physics. They'd hauled back several lengths of 4-inch diameter steel water pipe. Using a hacksaw and sheer muscle, they cut a 6-foot length. One end was welded shut, a frantic job done with a portable acetylene torch. The blue flame, a stark contrast to the gloom. They scavenged a heavy truck axle housing for a base plate, welding the pipe to it at a fixed, crude angle. They had no sophisticated sights, no bipod, no mechanism to adjust for range other than altering the powder charge. It was, in essence, a giant, crude, muzzle-loaded cannon. The ammunition was the next nightmare. They gathered dud 81mm mortar shells and unexploded German Nebelwerfer rockets from the battlefield, a task of unspeakable bravery. Working with terrifying delicacy, they removed the original fuse systems. They then crafted new ignition charges from small arms powder, packing them into tin cans. The shell would be dropped down the pipe, followed by a tin can charge. A firing pin, rigged from a truck starter spring, was attached to the base. It was a bomb waiting to happen. One flaw in the welding, one crack in the pipe, one mistake in the charge, and the entire contraption and its crew would vanish in a catastrophic explosion. As the team completed their work, their hands trembling not from cold but from raw nerves, the sound of the frontline battle roared ever closer. The crisis was here. At 16:30, with the left flank collapsing and German infantry less than 100 yards from the command post, Captain Gleason received the message. "Thunderbird is ready," was the code. He didn't hesitate. Fire for effect. All remaining coordinates, repeat. All pre-plotted coordinates. In the barn, Sergeant McGregor took a deep breath. His team stood back, taking what cover they could behind timber and stone. The first prepared Chalon American 81mm round was gingerly lowered into the mouth of the ominous steel pipe. A tin can charge followed. Mac said a silent prayer and pulled the lanyard attached to the homemade firing mechanism. Boom. The sound was not the familiar thump of a mortar. It was a deeper, angrier, more primal boom. A roar of contained violence that shook the very ground. The pipe weapon bucked violently on its base plate, a jet of flame and smoke erupting from its muzzle. For a heart-stopping second, no one knew if the shell had even left the tube, or if it would simply travel a few hundred feet and drop. Then, from the German tree line, a thunderous explosion erupted. It was on target. A cheer, raw and disbelieving, went up from the engineers. They had done it. They had created fire from scratch. Now, the real test began. Working with frantic speed, they became a factory of one. Drop shell. Insert charge. Clear. Area.
Pulaniot.
Boom. Adjust powder slightly for range. Boom. They had pre-plotted key coordinates. The road emerging from the woods, the suspected German command post area, the hold-down positions of the panzers. They began walking their makeshift, horrifically inaccurate fire along these points. On the front line, the effect was instantaneous and electrifying. American troops, pressed into their foxholes, heard the unfamiliar roar from their rear, followed seconds later by the shriek of an incoming round and a massive explosion in the enemy ranks. Then another, and another. The explosions were erratic, but they were there. Huge plumes of black dirt, snow, and debris shot into the gray sky among the German formations. The psychological impact was devastating. The German infantry, who had believed the American mortars support silent, were now being pummeled by some new, unknown, and terrifyingly loud weapon. Their orderly advance faltered, then fractured as men sought cover from the seemingly random but deadly blasts. More importantly, one of the Panzer IVs maneuvering to target the new weapon's position was bracketed by 2 near misses. Chunks of frozen earth rained down on its hull, fearing a direct hit from what they assumed was a powerful artillery piece. Both tanks prudently reversed, seeking the cover of the woods. Without their close armor support, the German infantry attack lost its momentum. Sergeant McGregor's team fired shell after shell. The pipe glowed a dull red hot at its base. They poured water on it, steam hissing violently, and kept firing. They used every scrap of explosive they had. American mortar shells, German rocket warheads, even fabricating crude projectiles from packed TNT and pipe fittings. For 45 relentless minutes, they fed the beast they had created. They lost count of the rounds, but later estimates would put the number at nearly 100 projectiles hurled toward the enemy. Captain Gleason, sensing the shift, ordered a limited counterattack on the left flank with his small reserve. The beleaguered American squad, seeing the Germans disorganized and reeling under the unexpected barrage, rallied and pushed back, retaking their positions. The line, once bent to the breaking point, stiffened. By 17:15 hours, as the early winter darkness began to deepen, the German assault sputtered out. The enemy withdrew back into the darkening woods, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The crossroads remained in American hands. The silence that fell over the battlefield was almost as shocking as the noise of combat. It was broken by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning debris. The immediate costs had been high. Captain Gleason's composite company had suffered over 30% casualties. But they had blunted a superior enemy force and, critically, bought another 12 hours for reinforcing elements of the 30th Infantry Division to arrive. An inspection of the Thunderbird gun the next morning revealed the extent of their gamble. The steel water pipe, now cooled, was warped, visibly fatigued. It had fired its last shell, but it had fired enough. Scouts investigating the German assembly areas found clear signs of the weapon's effectiveness. Craters, destroyed equipment, and evidence of a disrupted, bloodied attack. While the water pipe mortar was a unique, field-expedient weapon never officially adopted, the action at the Montmedy crossroads was a powerful testament to American engineering, ingenuity, and the defiant spirit of the soldier when pushed to the absolute limit. Captain Richard Gleason was awarded the Silver Star for his leadership. Sergeant Linus McGregor and each member of his Adaco fabrication team received the Bronze Star with Valor Device for their extraordinary initiative and courage under fire. The official citation reads, "By creating a functional artillery piece from salvage under direct enemy assault, they provided the critical fire support that turned the tide of the battle." The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion continued its heroic work through the rest of the Bulge, famously creating and holding the crucial bridge at But for the men who were there on December 21st, 1944, the memory would always be of the cold, the fear, the roar of the panzers, and then the deeper, answering roar of a weapon that should never have been a weapon born of water pipes and sheer, unyielding will. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story not of grand strategy, but of desperate invention. A story where the difference between defeat and holding the line was measured in inches of steel pipe and the courage to try the impossible. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.